So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Philippa. I understand that she gets quite a lot of invitations to talks like these, and she's very discriminating and only comes to talks with people who might understand. And I've said to her, please tell us how it is and don't hold back, and we will be absolutely fascinated to hear how you found King Richard III's body under this car park in Leicester. And was it a psychic moment? Was it dowsing? Or was it a bit of both? And is there any difference? Thank you.
Right, thanks, Richard. Can you hear me okay? Yes, we're good, yeah. I think as Richard said, I don't accept too many invitations, but when Peter sent me his email, I'm afraid this one I had to accept. And I think I emailed him back almost within about 10 minutes of him sending the email. Because what's going to be fascinating for me is I'm going to tell you the story of what happened, but I would really like to hear sort of questions and answers about what you think about it, because that's what's really going to make my day. So I'm going to talk to you about the Looking for Richard project. Now, I know we don't have a whole heap of time, and it was a 7.5-year project. So what I'm going to do is really just do a very fast fly-through so that you get a sense of everything that happened with the project. But what I am going to do, because it's you guys, there's a certain part of the story that I don't always go into too much detail. But in this part of the story, I'm going to go into every detail that I can give you, so that maybe we can have a discussion afterwards as what you guys think was going on. So right, let's have a look. What am I going to talk to you about? I'm going to tell you a little bit about how a screenwriter, that's me, came to undertake, the first ever search for the lost grave of an anointed king of England. And also tell you a little bit about why, when it came to write the book about the search, I wrote it with military historian Mike Jones. And I want to go into a little bit about the 3 questions that we needed to answer to get the search underway, and the 4 years of research that it took. And also a little bit of the 3.5-year battle in Leicester to get the tarmac cut. And when I say a battle, it was one hell of a battle. Also a bit about the dig and the discovery and where we are now. And I want to end with a little bit of myth busting as well. Actually, Matt, can you put the lights down just a little bit? Yeah, that's a bit better, thanks, great. So, how did a screenwriter come to undertake the first ever search for the lost grave of an anointed king of England? Well, I hadn't been taught about Richard III at school, so what I had in my mind was pretty much the Shakespearean villain. But in 1998, I read a biography on Richard by Paul Murray Kendall. And for me, it was a revelation, because what Kendall did was he used the historic sources to talk about a very different kind of man, to talk about a man who was loyal, brave, pious, and just. So I was absolutely intrigued, because how did this fit with sort of the evil villain of Shakespeare and the Tudor writers? So I started researching Richard. And as I researched him, I just became absolutely fascinated, because what I found was pretty much screenwriting gold. Not only did this man have the most extraordinary story, but from what I could see, he had the most extraordinary character as well. And, I could see that he was complex and that he was conflicted and flawed, as we all are. That's pretty much the human condition. But within that, I could see that he had the most immense courage and the most immense conviction. But strangely, having grown up in really sort of brutal times, he seemed to be a bit of an idealist and at times also naive. So as a screenwriter, I was absolutely fascinated by this. But as I researched him, I could see very clearly, up until about the age of 30, you see in the historic record, and you do see the sort of the loyal, the brave, the pious, the just guy. That's who you see. But then, as we know, Richard died aged 32 at the Battle of Bosworth. But at the age of 30, there's this huge event takes place, and his brother, who's the king, King Edward IV, dies in 1483. And Richard goes in this 4-month period from being Richard Duke of Gloucester to becoming Richard III. And it's this 4-month period where it's like almost like a nuclear bomb goes off, because everything changes. But when I was looking at this period, I kind of look at it in a very different way to the way that historians will look at it, because they will take this 4-month period that the Tudor writers wrote quite heavily about, and an awful lot of things happened, and they will get Richard's character from that 4-month period. But for a screenwriter, we don't work that way. The way that we work is we look at someone's life up until, about the early 20s to try and decipher what their character is from that. And then you take that man and then you drop them into the events in which they found themselves. So you can see the historians and the screenwriters are coming from two completely different ways. But what happened to me was when I took the 30-year-old man with his character formed and developed and dropped him into this 4-month period, it just wouldn't work. It was like this jigsaw puzzle that I just couldn't get to go. So by now it was about 2002, and I was going to walk away from Richard III and his story, because I thought, this is why we've never seen his story on the cinematic screen. This is why they always punch out Shakespeare all the time, because, people, other writers must have got to the same place I've got to and just found him to be too opaque. But then in 2002, there was a new book published, and it was by this chap, and this is Dr. Michael Jones, military historian, and it was Bosworth 1485, Psychology of a Battle. Now, what Mike did in this book was he was the very first historian to put Richard back into the context of his family. Now, that doesn't sound like such a big thing, but it was huge, because up until this point, most historians had always treated Richard pretty much like Shakespeare did, as this sort of lone sort of shark operating on the fringes of society and on the fringes of his family as well. And what Mike's work did, using the historic sources, he said, look, this is not how medieval families worked. And Richard was a very big part of his family. So I met Mike Jones, and I discovered that we both had this need to sort of try and find the real Richard III, not the bad Richard III or the good Richard III, but the real Richard III. And what I found that was also amazing was a lot more of the research that Mike had done. Was when I put it into my screenplay, it was like this jigsaw puzzle that I had. Suddenly the pieces of the jigsaw just went click, click, click. So, not only did I now have the character of the man that I wanted to write about, but I also had the story that I wanted to tell. So I hope you can understand that when I came to write the story of the search for Richard III, I wanted to do it with Mike Jones, because without his work in 2002, my work with Richard would have stopped then. So continuing on with the research, hang on, let's move on to the next one. I was looking at Richard's life now, because as a screenwriter, this is what I was fascinated with. And some Ricardians had said, they'd heard that I was going to go to Bosworth, and they said, Philippa, why don't you go to Leicester? Because there's a piece of medieval wall in a car park there that they thought is part of the larger Greyfriars precinct in Leicester. And somewhere in that precinct was the Greyfriars Church where Richard was buried. Now, I wasn't really going to go because I was interested in Richard's life, but because I was at Bosworth and I was close by, I decided, okay, I'm going to go. So I did, and I went and had a look, and this is the medieval wall. You can see this sort of lighter coloured stone here. And I went into this car park, and this is called the New Street car park in Leicester. And I had a wander around, and it was a lovely car park, don't get me wrong, but I didn't get any sense of anything to do with the history there, any sense to do with anything. So I left to go home. But as I left to go home, I saw another car park opposite. Now, the car park where I'd been, the New Street car park, is here. This is that car park. Now, for those of you in the audience that know Leicester, Leicester Cathedral is just about here, in that area there. And the wall, the medieval wall, was here. So I left New Street car park, and came out to leave to go down this road to go home. But as I came down this road, I saw this car park here. Now, this is the social services car park in Leicester. And this is when I got this overwhelming urge to walk into this car park. And I know you're probably thinking this woman has a thing about car parks. I don't. But on this day, it was an afternoon, it was very quiet, it was in late spring, so it was nice and warm, and the thing was, it was a private car park, and there was a barrier over the road saying private, but there was nobody about. So I thought, right, so I just sort of snucked in round the barrier and went into, and this is the social services car park. Now, the entrance to the car park is here. This is where kind of the barrier was. Now, what I'm going to tell you now is exactly what happened to me in this car park, because I am still not able to explain it, but I don't know, maybe you guys can, I don't know. But as I walked into this car park, the first thing that I felt immediately was that I had a really, really dry mouth, and it came out of nowhere. And my heart was pounding in my chest, and the only way that I can describe it to you is it felt like fear tinged with excitement. That's what it felt like. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. I don't know why I'm feeling that. But the second thing, that I was drawn to this wall, this Victorian wall running north-south, which is straight ahead of me. So I just walked towards this wall. And as I walked towards the wall, it was in pretty much, you see where this red car is here? It was in pretty much in this area here that I had to stop. Because the only way I can describe it to you is, you know when you say, ooh, I've just felt like someone's walked over my grave. You know, and you go with, it's like all the hairs in your body just go like a cat. And in fact, that's what I call it. I call it my cat, because I literally just felt like all the hairs in my body just went like that. And I was covered in goosebumps. From head to toe, I was covered in goosebumps. And I got so cold that I actually had to put my jumper back on. And all I can say is it just felt like in that spot I was walking on Richard's grave. And that's the only way that I can describe it to you. So I left the car park and I went home, and I told my friends and family about the experience, and they said, look, Philippa, don't dismiss it. It might mean something. But do you know what? Dismiss it. I did. But a year later, I was going back to Leicester, and I thought, I'm going to go back to the car park because I need to test if that whatever I felt that day was real. And so I did, and I went back to the social services car park, and I went back to the area, and I went back to, you see this area here where the red car is? I went back to that area there, and I saw something new, something that I hadn't seen before. Somebody had painted a hand-painted letter R onto the tarmac, clearly for reserved, but for me, it told me everything that I needed to know. And to give you some idea, this is where the R was painted. The R was on the tarmac there. And this is where I'd had my experience there. So that's the first parking bay, the second and the third. So it was literally just to my left. So I had the experience again, and I thought, you know, okay, I have to follow this. I have to do something about it. But what it was, however strange, well, it's not going to sound strange maybe to you guys, but this experience became the catalyst and the driver for a complete 180-degree turn in my research focus. Because as a screenwriter, I was fascinated by Richard's life. But after this happened to me, I became fascinated by Richard's death. And I needed then to start new research to look into his burial and, you know, into all of that. And as I started looking into his death and his burial, it became very clear that if we were ever to have any hope of getting any search to go and, you know, to look for his grave, there was three major questions that we would need to answer. And I mean, number one, that question, I mean, how could we identify Richard even if we found him? that was the big one, because you can understand in medieval times they were pretty violent, pretty brutal. And if we were, looking and excavating a church, we will most likely find quite a few skeletons of young males who had died in a violent death. So that was a really important question. The second question was, was Richard's grave actually there, or had he been thrown into the River Soar, as everyone believed and as the story went? And this was a really powerful story that had begun in about 1611, which said that Richard's remains had been dug up at the time of the dissolution, carried through the streets of Leicester by a jeering angry mob, and then thrown into the nearby River Soar. So if that story was true, then clearly there's going to be no Richard under that tarmac. And the third question was, where was the Greyfriars Church? Now, I'll go into the size of the area of the Greyfriars in Leicester a little bit later on. But these were the three main questions that I now needed to answer. And in fact, I'm going to show you something. I haven't got time to go into the research today because we really only have, the limited minutes that we have. But what we did, we decided to put, for those of you who like research and that's your bent, this is the academic research that went into finding Richard III, and it took 4 years to put it all together. And what was the most amazing thing was when we did the research and I looked into all of the documentation on it, was that it pretty much said that the Church of the Greyfriars should be in the same place where I had my experience. So this is called Finding Richard III, the official account. And I've written this with the other Looking for Richard project team members. But one of the people that I want to introduce you to now very quickly is this guy. This is Dr. John Ashdown Hill. And the strangest thing that happened within literally a few weeks of me walking that car park and seeing the letter R, John publicised his discovery. And what John had discovered was the mitochondrial DNA sequence of Richard III. So immediately question 1 had been answered. So then I started working with John on research, and what John did was he looked into the River Soar story. And what John's research concluded was that it was just that it was a myth. And the research that I was looking into agreed with that. So though it left the third question, where was the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester? Now, this is the area of the precinct of the Greyfriars in Leicester. And this is no secret. This has been known, forever. But to give you some idea of the area that we're looking at, Leicester Cathedral is there, and the R in the car park is pretty much there. But what you've got is the area stretches all the way along here. It's off here, down here, along here, and all the way back and over here. So you've got an area in the centre of Leicester which is pretty much nearly 7 acres. Also, to put it in another way, you're looking at 5 international football fields. So in this area, not only did we have to find a small priory church, we also had to find 1 grave. So it'll give you some idea of the task before us. But in 2009, I finally and eventually met John Ashdown Hill. And when we met, we both agreed on where we felt the Church of the Greyfriars was. And it was here, right here, in the northern side of the Social Services car park. So with all of this information on board, I then thought, right, it's time for a search. So I got in touch with Leicester City Council and pitched it to them, and this was in 2010, and they were interested. But what I then needed to do was to try and get archaeologists on board, because what I then needed to find was not only the funding, but the professional, team who would be willing to do the digging work. And it was then that I met this guy. Oh, sorry, no, I'm going to go back and tell you one more thing first. Right, when we were looking at the Church of the Greyfriars and where it was, this is one of the maps that I came up with during my research. And you remember Leicester Cathedral, which was opposite the road? I don't know if you can see it. I know it's very small. But this is St. Martin's Church here, which is now Leicester Cathedral. And then you have the road, which is St. Martin's Road here, which hasn't changed. But then this church here is the Greyfriars Church. So what, where they made a programme about the search for Richard called The King in the Car Park. And what was edited out of that programme was basically what became my mantra at the dig, because I kept saying church, road, church. Because for me, this was the northern side of the social services car park. So anyway, as you know, I needed to get an archaeological team on board, and I'm hoping this one will be Richard Buckley. Is it? Yes, it is. This is Richard Buckley, and he is the director of ULAS in Leicester, and I pitched the project to him. And Richard was very open about it. He said, okay, Philippa, it's a bit of an intriguing one, but we don't really go in search of famous things. It's not what we do. But I'll have a look at the research. And what Richard did was he did a map regression analysis where he looked at all of the maps over a period of time. And the map that Richard found was this one. This is Thomas Roberts' map of 1741. Now, this map I hadn't seen before, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. Because, I don't know if you can see here in the north, this is St. Martin's Church, Leicester Cathedral. Then we've got the road, St. Martin's, and then you've got all this area laid out as the Greyfriars. Now, strangely, the letter R in the car park? You see the letter R of Greyfriars? How weird is that? But what I was jumping up and down about when Richard showed me this map was this sort of formal garden area here. Because the last known marker to Richard's grave came from 1612 by a mayor of Leicester called Herrick, who built a mansion house in this area with a garden. And in his garden was a 3-foot stone pillar which said, "Here lies King Richard, the body of King Richard III, sometime King of England." And this is the last known marker to the King's grave. So for me, when Richard Buckley showed me this map, I was jumping up and down about this, because I said, if you've got a king in your garden and you've got a central feature here, wouldn't you put, so that it's the main feature of your garden? So when we looked at that and Richard overlaid it onto a modern map of Leicester, this fell into a school playground, which was slightly to the east. So what I then did was I got the school playground people to give me permission to sort of dig their car park if we needed to dig that one as well. So I had Richard Buckley on board and we were all ready to go, and I'd got the funding in and the dig was ready to go for April 2012. So all I had to do now was sort of like the final piece of the research, which is a ground penetrating radar survey. Now let's have a look. Have I got a picture of that? Oh yeah, I have, right. This is now August 2011, and this is in the social services car park, and the letter R is just kind of this area here. And what we're using is a Mira scanner. Now this is the most powerful scanner that we could get, because what we had to do was try and look through the tarmac of the car park to see if we could pick up any lines of the church or the claustral buildings of the Greyfriars to see if they were there. So we undertook this, and it took about a month, and the team that did it was Stratascan, and they're one of the leading specialists in the country on finding churches and on finding burials. And I was going to go and see Channel 4 as soon as the results were in. So, I was eagerly awaiting these results, and then the results came through, and they were a complete and total disaster. What you can see here are gas pipes, sewage pipes, electric cables, manhole covers, and a little bit of rubble. And to give you some idea, my letter R, you see that area there where there's absolutely nothing. So I was desperate by this point, because I was going to go and see Channel 4 because they were interested in doing the programme, which was helping keep the funding going. And I said to them, please show me a grave. Is there a grave? I've got to give them something. And the team, the GPR team, said, okay, if you're pushing us, Philippa, we would say that this area here, there's a little red rectangle there, which is in the school playground. That looks like it could be a grave, because it's orientated east-west as well. Now, for those of you that have looked into the dig and know what we found a stone sarcophagus burial, and that was it. That was the sarcophagus burial. But basically what happened was I took these results to Channel 4. Channel 4 looked at them and said, well, there's nothing. And I said, yes, I know there's nothing, but you never know, there might be something. And anyway, it was the most awful meeting because basically they were pulling away because they were thinking this is a wild goose chase. Because they were pulling away, the funding fell through and then the dig collapsed. The dig was over. But do you know what? I'd gone so far down the line now that I couldn't give up and I had to try again. And what was lovely was Leicester City Council said, look, Philippa, we'll give you new dates. We'll give you the August bank holiday, 2012, if you can get the money. But if you don't get the money this time, that's it. It's over. We can't put any more time and effort and input into this anymore. It's too much. Okay, so what I did is, how am I going to get the money and where am I going to get the money from? And I called this guy. Now, this is Dr. Phil Stone. He's the chairman of the Richard III Society. And although we were too late to launch an appeal in their magazine, what Phil did was he gave me £5,000 to kickstart the money, the funding. And what this did was enabled me to get the rest of the funding in. Now, I needed £35,000, and I know that doesn't sound too much for an archaeological dig, and it's not. But you need to remember we were in the worst ever recession in recorded history and in living memory. And believe you me, nobody was giving us any money. So basically what happened, I managed to get enough of the money in, but then with 2 weeks to go, £10,000 of the funding was pulled. And I had 2 weeks to find the money. And that's when I called this lady, who was a key member of the Looking for Richard team. This is Annette Carson, and she's author of Richard III, the Maligned King. But what a lot of people don't know about Annette is she's an internationally award-winning copywriter. And what Annette did was put together an international appeal leaflet, which Phil Stone authorised me to send to Ricardians, to the branches and groups around the world, to see if we could raise the money. And he warned me, and he said, look, Philippa, Ricardians, we don't have much money, so... But he said, you know, you can try if you want to. And I thought, well, we've got to try. We had 2 weeks left to go. And you know what? In 2 weeks, not only did we raise that £10,000, but we raised £13,000 from Ricardians all around the world, and it was staggering. And in fact, they became the principal funding body of the 3-week project. They put in, Ricardians, 53% of the total money that we needed. So the dig was now ready to get underway, and the interesting thing about the start day for the dig was it was August the 25th, 2012, and it was the exact anniversary of the day that Richard had been buried in the Greyfriars in Leicester in 1485. So what have we got next? Yeah, this is the trench layout that the archaeologists put together for the dig. And to give you some idea, that is trench 1, that is trench 2, and this is the proposed trench 3 in the school playground, and that actually did happen in the end. That's exactly the way we went. And you know, Richard Buckley put in his trenches, and you know, I was sort of saying, okay, let me know, let me see where they are, because clearly I was very interested in one particular spot. Now Richard knew I was, and he knew I'd asked him how much test pits would cost, because if Richard's trenches weren't going over that area, I needed the money to put in test pits to see what was there. But as you can see, his trench 1, the letter R is literally just there. So I was a happy girl. So we cut the tarmac, and we cut the tarmac on the 25th of August, and this is in the social services car park, and this is literally 10 minutes in. Now, the letter R had literally just crumbled. It was here. It had just been taken from there. And yes, I did go and look to see if I could find it, but it had gone. It had literally crumbled. But to give you some idea, where I'd had my experience was pretty much here, where the track is there. And the very first thing that we found was that we found a leg bone. And it was found literally in this area here. And it was found by our site director, and this is Matthew Morris, who's our site director. And without his keen eyes spotting this leg bone, Richard III would never have been found. But, Matthew went into the trench and said it's definitely a lower leg bone, and he could see that there was another leg bone attached to it. So you can imagine I was jumping up and down like a complete idiot. And the archaeologists were like, oh, Philippa, no. We've only started digging. We don't know if we're in the Greyfriars yet. We don't even know if this is a medieval burial, never mind, it could be Georgian, it could be Victorian, and we don't even know if it is a burial. It could just be a couple of odd bones. So what we then did, we had to dig for another week, and we did. The archaeologists dug on. And this is pretty much after the first week. And to give you some idea, the letter R was here, and where I'd had my experience in the car park was about here. And what they did was just over this sort of concrete wall here, they uncovered a massive robbed out wall, and it looked to be the church of the Greyfriars. By this point, the archaeologists knew that we were in the Greyfriars area, and this seemed to confirm that it was the church. So we agreed to dig a trench in the playground in Trench 3. And Richard Buckley and I had a meeting, and Richard said, right, I'm going to exhume remains in Trench 3 because that's further east. And this made absolute sense because Richard was buried in the choir of the church, which is always in the eastern end of the church. But do you know what? By now, it had been a 7.5-year journey for me to get to this point. And Richard said, I'm not interested in the remains in Trench 1, because it looks like they're in the nave of the church and there'll be a friar. We've only got a limited budget, so I'm not going to dig them up. But I had £800 left from the Ricardian International Appeal. So I said to Richard, I've got this money. Is that going to be enough money for you to exhume the remains in Trench 1? And Richard said, yes, that £800 will cover it. So we did, and we went ahead and exhumed the remains in Trench 1. And this is it going underway on the 4th and 5th of September. And, it did take 2 days because they were pretty far down. But what we discovered was a male skeleton with severe battle trauma and also a very severe scoliosis of the spine. And this was pretty much just a few moments after we fully removed him. And this is in the exact place, the area where I had had that very strange experience 7.5 years previously. So we found Richard, in that exact place. So, a lot of people have sort of said to me, so what does that mean, Philippa? Does that tell us anything more? You've just found a bunch of bones. In fact, hang on, let me just check what the next one is. Yeah. They said you've just found a bunch of bones. It doesn't really tell us anything more. Well, actually, it tells us an awful lot more, because by finding Richard's remains, we've been able to blow so many of the myths that surround this man. He's one of our most controversial historical figures. And I just want to give you a sense of some of the myths that we've been able to blow just by finding him. We know that his remains weren't dug up at the time of the dissolution. We know that they weren't carried through the streets by the angry mob. We know that he wasn't thrown into the River Soar. And we also know that he wasn't hunchbacked. Now, this is the most inappropriate word to use, but we don't have another. And for those of you who saw the television program that was made about the search for Richard, when they uncovered the remains, the specialist there said, oh, he's hunchbacked. Now, this for me absolutely threw me, totally threw me, because I'd been researching this man for so many years, and what was very clear was that he was very physically active and very physically able. He'd fought in 3 battles. We have his itinerary. The man was never off a horse. He simply never stopped. So it just didn't add up to me. And we also have contemporary accounts of those that met Richard who have described him. And nobody mentions, that he's hunchback. So I was trying to make this work in my mind, but what we discovered was when the scientists took him back to the laboratory and they laid him out, they discovered that he wasn't hunchbacked. He didn't have kyphosis. And kyphosis is when the head is pushed forward and down and onto the chest. what they discovered was that the grave had been cut too short for Richard, so hence that's why his head was on his chest. But what they discovered was he had a scoliosis. And scoliosis, as you know, is a very common thing, and many, many people have it. In fact, I've discovered that my best girlfriend has it and my goddaughter has it. And, you know, people like Usain Bolt, Elizabeth Taylor, you know, these people also have scoliosis, so it doesn't stop a physically active lifestyle, which then made sense to me. Then it became clear that, you know, this is helping identify Richard. Because one thing it does with scoliosis is it gives you one shoulder slightly higher than the other. Now, you can't generally see this in clothing, because in Richard's day he wore very rich velvets which were heavy, so you wouldn't have seen it. So hence why the contemporary accounts of Richard don't mention anything abnormal. And we've only got one account of Richard just immediately following his death, where somebody does write that he had one shoulder higher than the other. So this now confirms that, you know, we had a really good candidate for Richard III. But to put this into context for you, you know, if you're thinking about how would we have seen Richard if he was alive now and sort of with us in this room, well, our Queen today has one shoulder higher than the other. Now, do we talk about it? Is it a big thing? Do we mention it? Does the media make a big thing of it? No. And this is exactly how we now think it was for Richard III. But also, you know, going back into sort of the Shakespearean portrayal of Richard, we know that he didn't have the limping gait because he had straight hips and his legs were perfectly straight. We also know that he didn't have the withered arm because his arms were exactly the same on both sides. And we also know that his head did not strike Bow Bridge. There's this story that when he was flung over his horse coming into Leicester, that his head hit the bridge then, and it was a fable. But we know there's no marks on Richard's skull to show that. But I think when we look at this, it gives us an idea of that, you know, when we're studying history, we have to be really, really careful about what is myth and what is truth. Because many of these things that you're seeing on this board were deemed by the historians today as being truths. But I think what is also most important is we have to be really careful about what is, you know, more importantly, what is propaganda. Because we do know that history is always written by the winners. And I think one thing that we do know now is that, you know, propaganda for Richard has been pretty vicious, and that his, you know, condition of scoliosis has been used against him. And, you know, you're probably thinking, well, you know, can we really say that? Well, yeah, actually we can, because his remains have been able to tell us this as well. Because the one thing that we do know that happened to Richard was at Bosworth, when he was killed at Bosworth, he was stripped naked and his body was thrown over a horse to be taken back into Leicester. Now, the reason for this was Henry Tudor was going to put him on public display. And the reason that you put, you know, like a dead king on public display is you want to show the people that he's dead so that they can see very clearly that you are now the new king, to make your path to the throne much, much easier and quicker. Because Richard had left Leicester the day before, so Henry Tudor, in returning Richard to Leicester, was returning him to the very people that had just seen him. So they knew what Richard looked like. So one of the things that the remains have shown us is that the injuries to Richard's face, he only had one injury to his face, and that was pretty much a dagger wound here at the side of his nose. Now, this is really abnormal for medieval battles, because what used to happen at the end of medieval battles was they used to smash people's faces in to remove their identity. It was sort of a medieval thing that you did to the dead. But with Richard, clearly his face was important because it's hardly been touched. So here's a paradox. You have Henry Tudor, who needs to show that Richard is dead. He needs the people of Leicester and those who'd just seen the alive king the day before to see his face. So what does Henry Tudor do? He throws Richard's naked body over the side of a horse. Now, if you do that, do you see Richard's face? No, because his face is against the side of the horse. So clearly something else was going on, and this is what we now think was going on. This is a scoliosis patient. Now you can see when he's standing, he's got one shoulder slightly higher than the other. But what happens is when you've got scoliosis and you bend right over, you get a prominence here in the side of the ribs, in that area there. So what we now know that was happening was Henry Tudor had thrown Richard's naked body over the side of a horse, not to show his face, but to show his scoliosis. So within moments of Richard's death, the Tudor propaganda machine had started, because what Henry Tudor was saying was crooked body, crooked mind. And how do we know this? Well, again, if you look at the post-mortem injuries that were inflicted on Richard's body, he had 2 injuries inflicted, and they were inflicted by a dagger. Whether it was the same dagger, we don't know. But what he got was, he got a dagger wound to the backside here, but he also got a dagger wound to the right-hand side of his rib cage at the back. So it looks like someone had stabbed his backside and then stabbed his scoliosis, because in the medieval mind, if you have a crooked body, then it shows that you're evil inside. So I think what I'd like to sort of say is, one of the things you haven't seen in this talk is I haven't put up any pictures of Richard's remains. And I wanted to do that very deliberately, because I wanted you to think about Richard III as a screenwriter does, as a human being who lived and breathed and had a life, and not just as a pile of old bones. But I didn't want you to think about him as a scientific specimen or resource, object or relic. I'm just quickly going to check the time here. Right, am I about right? I'm just going to go into one other thing which is really interesting for me, and I'm sure you guys are going to know about this, but it's that question of that thing that happened to me in the car park, that experience that I had. Has that happened before? And I'm sure this audience here is going to say, well, yes, Philippa, it happens a lot. But, I wanted to look sort of historically to see if that had happened before. And this is the one that I love. It's the story that really gets me every time. And it happened to this lady. And her name is Edith Pretty. And I can see lots of you smiling, so you know what I'm going to say. But Edith Pretty lived in Suffolk in the early part of the 20th century. And she had a very large garden. And in that garden, she had a lot of large earth mounds. And on one of these particular earth mounds, Edith Pretty had had this intuitive experience and felt that it was a grave. And archaeologists came to dig her land, and they didn't dig the mound that she wanted them to dig. They went off and dug another couple of mounds. And they found some bits and pieces of interesting material and went away. But then they came back a couple of years later, and I think it was about 1938, and they came back. And so Edith Pretty said, right, well, if you're going to dig my land, this time you dig where I want you to dig, and you dig Mound 1. So the archaeologists did dig Mound 1, and this is what they found. They found Sutton Hoo, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. And strangely enough, it was the burial place of another king. It was the 7th century king, King Raedwald of East Anglia. So I'm hoping we're going to have a very good question and answer session, and I really, really do want you to thank you for letting me come and talk to you today. Thank you.
Philippa, thank you for this fascinating account. And what impressed me most behind all the detail is your commitment to see this through over such a long period, and to hear your personal experience when you got the wobbles in the graveyard, in the car park, in the graveyard. So, time for questions. We've got just under half an hour. Who would like to start? Gentleman over there. Can you tell us your name, please?
Jeff Griffiths. Philippa, you've left out two details that I seem to recall when you spoke in Leicester. It spoke in Windsor, rather, that when the first spade went into the car park, that there was a clap of thunder, am I right? And also that you only had a license to raise one body, and the archaeologists were pointing to one particular body, and you said, no, this is the one we must raise. Am I correct on those 2 points?
Yeah, you are. I mean, what happened was, it was when we unearthed that lower leg bone, and the archaeologist Matthew Morris that you saw the picture of, he then went and did a little bit of light work around that bone and found an adjacent bone to it. They'd literally unearthed the bones for about 5 minutes when we were getting out of the trench, because we were moving along a bit and deciding what to do about these leg bones. When I looked up and I saw the spire of, Leicester Cathedral, which was just over the wall, and I saw the biggest, blackest, darkest cloud that you had ever seen, and we just knew there was moments before the most massive storm was going to hit, and it did hit, and it was thunder and lightning. It just went, so there was I was running around like a mad thing trying to protect these bones, because I thought, if this is all we have of Richard, if we've got no more of him, we've got to protect the DNA, we've got to. So I was in the trench covered in mud and soaked to the skin and trying to put things from a distance onto him, fine bags, clean fine bags. And, I remember afterwards going into a sheltered area with Matthew Morris, the lead archaeologist, and I was just like, God, this is amazing. It's like a Shakespearean scene. We've just unearthed these bones, and we've got, Shakespeare would have loved this, because there was like the thunder and the lightning. And I remember Matthew just looking at me as going, oh God, she's gone. So absolutely, yeah, that happened. And again, with the archaeologists, we had enough money to exhume 6 sets of remains, but only one for analysis, one for identification analysis. And Richard Buckley said, I'm going to exhume remains in Trench 3, because we'd seen so many grave cuts in Trench 3. But I had to say, no, it has to be this one, and I'll give you the extra money to do it, because I couldn't do this journey and walk away without them checking that set of remains, and that was Richard. Yeah.
And I think I said to you, Philippa, I think you're an unconscious dowser at that point. I don't know how many other people had suggested it to you up to then.
Right.
Well, I think that is testament to your commitment. Can we have another question? Gentleman at the back in the middle. Yeah, wait for the microphone, it's coming. And then the gentleman over on that side.
Philippa, it's Richard Nissen. Can we have a vote of this lot here, all of us, of whether we think, Philippa, you were doing deviceless dowsing?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see that. Yeah, so.
What about it, Richard?
Well, can I suggest we just have some discussion about that, and then people will have the information to vote on, but fair enough.
Okay.
Would you like to say something about that? Do you think you were dowsing, or was it a psychic twitch?
Psychic twitch, I love it. Do you know, I can't say that I was dowsing, even though I told Richard about it earlier. That someone came to my house and did some dowsing at my house years and years and years ago, and gave me a go at it, and I was dowsing in my house, so I do know about dowsing. But I wouldn't have said that I was dowsing, because I wasn't going into that car park to look for anything. It was really weird. It was all, it all happened in such a way that, it just all took me by surprise. But when I say that, that experience that I got, I call it the cat. I've had that before, and I've had it since I was a child. And I can't explain what it is, but it's when, if somebody says something that's so true, and it's so true, inherently true, that's when I get it. And it's like a sign for somebody, whatever, to tell me that you've just heard a major truth spoken. And I can see some of you nodding here. So maybe that's, I don't know what that is. I don't know where that comes from. But that's how it was for me. So not actually dowsing.
Well, I've heard people call that the bristle, where the hairs go up on the back of your neck, like a cat, or particularly a cat or a dog does when they're in danger of attack. Yeah, but I mean, you were in danger of discovery, which is not far different. Gentleman over there, thank you. Can you tell us your name?
Thank you. Stephen Jones. Philippa, you said when he was put on, Richard III was put on his horse, they turned his back to the people to show the scoliosis. But if he'd so many clothes on when he was in Leicester, how would they know he had scoliosis?
Well, you see, that's the point. They didn't.
So
the first time his scoliosis would have been seen was at Bosworth when he was stripped naked.
Right. But would they not want to see his face first and then the scoliosis?
I don't think so, because what we do know is one of his heralds, Blanc Sanglier, there's a report that says his herald was made to ride in front of him. So they were saying that this is the king's herald, this is the king's body. But when he did get into Leicester, then he was rolled out, and that's when he was laid out and his face was shown.
Right, okay, thank you. And you said his head didn't bang against the bridge because there was no trauma to the skull, but could it have just been a facial knock? Obviously there's no face left, so it will be difficult to tell now, perhaps.
Well, no, because his face was hardly damaged at all. And, we've got his skull, and we could see very clearly even the slight skid marks from when he was attacked on the battlefield, but there was no crack.
Right.
Because apparently if his head had hit the bridge, there would have been some minor mark, and they've gone over it with a fine-tooth comb, and they've said there's nothing.
Right,
There's
thank
nothing
you.
there.
Without getting too gory, presumably the stab in his backside was from somebody coming up when he was on his horse, and the one in his back was to finish him off when he was on the ground.
Funnily enough, the one in his backside was done when he was dead. It was a post-mortem death,
Right.
post-mortem injury.
Injury, yes.
So we think that was done when he was flung over the horse naked, and he was stabbed in the backside and then stabbed in the prominence here, because it was a mark of the disgust that the soldiers felt when they saw him.
Gory business. Another question, please. Gentleman, a lady at the back. Thank you. Has got another one?
Did you ever come across a small red book which purported to have a clairvoyant medium connection with Richard's spirit, in which they said that the princes were killed on the orders of the church by bullying Richard? There was a whole book about these seances with Richard's spirits. Have you ever seen that?
It's a small red book. What does it say? It says that the princes were killed on the orders of the church for...
The church threatened Richard.
They
with
threatened
excommunication
Richard?
if he didn't kill them. But this
Lord,
is the
I haven't.
medium's interpretation of communication with his spirit. Have you ever seen that?
No, I haven't seen that
I
book.
can't trace it, but it's a whole book about these seances with Richard's spirit.
Right, okay, I will look for that. I will have a look and see if I can find
I think it was
it.
published by a small private publisher. I've forgotten the name and the place, unfortunately, but it's a fascinating book.
Okay. Well, I'm sure Ricardians will know about that, so I will ask them about
Put it on the
that.
net and see if they know about it.
Right.
It's a tiny, thin red book by two mediums, or media, whoever they are.
Okay.
Are two mediums a media?
We could be here all afternoon.
Yeah,
Thank
that
you.
would be
Was there another question out of the corner of my eye? Yes. Can you wait for the microphone and tell us your name?
Hello, Philippa. It's Clive Essery. I was going to ask if you'd had any similar feelings, because I wondered if it was that you were specifically connected to that person, Richard, or whether it's just something that you can do from time to time. And from what you've just said, it seems to me that you have a way of saying, yes, something is true when you hear something, and we do it with dowsing rods or sometimes deviceless dowsing, but you seem to have a reaction when you know that there's a truth. So in my view, you're more of a psychic rather than somebody that is specifically connected with Richard, because I had wondered if you'd had a past life experience and had been close to him in that life, that might have allowed you to connect to the body.
Right, okay.
But it
All right.
seems to me anyway, I don't know if everybody else agrees, that you probably are a psychic without realising it.
Okay.
You learn something every day.
Absolutely. This is why I had to come to here today, because I knew this would be quite interesting discussion here.
Okay, so we've got a bit of the dowsing vote and a bit of the psychic vote. Lady here, can you wait for the microphone and tell us your name? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Liz Mars, Philippa. And I think most people in this room agree that the universal intelligence is just beyond belief at times. And because of this, I believe that you were chosen because you had the ability and the knowledge to go ahead with the information. It wasn't just anyone, it wasn't me standing there feeling that there's something more, because there was little I'd be able to do about it. I didn't have the knowledge, the ability, or the position that you had. So I believe you were very specially chosen.
Right. Well, do you know, one of the things I said with the dig was, as I was doing it, it felt like Richard wanted to be found, like the time was right. And it's very strange to put that into words, but that's how it felt. Yes. Yeah.
But you were the right person to deal with it, as has been proven.
That is remarkable. If I could chip in a question about Edith Pretty, I mean, maybe she knew in the same way. Maybe the time was right for Sutton Hoo. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, because she told the archaeologists, you either dig there or just go away,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah, she was on a mission. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, gentleman here. Could you wait for the microphone and tell us your name? Who's got a microphone? Here it comes. Thank you.
Henry Owen from Cornwall. How did you prove the original DNA?
Oh, right, yes, this was Dr. John Ashdown Hill. John is a historian and a genealogist, and what he did was he was actually looking into some bones that they thought might be Richard's sister in Burgundy, called Margaret of Burgundy. But what he did was he traced an all-female line from Richard's eldest sister, Anne of York, all the way to the present day, to a family called the Ibsens, who had emigrated to Canada, to a lady called Joy Ibsen, who was the mother. She's a retired journalist. And luckily enough, with Ashdown Hill, if he was here today, he'd tell you, he had to pick up the phone to this lady, Joy Ibsen, who he'd never spoken to, never met, to basically say, hello, I'm a historian and I've traced this line and I think you might be descended from Richard III, and can I have some of your DNA? So, you can imagine, John was making this phone call and thought, you know, it's going to live or die with this phone call. And what was so lovely was Joy was a retired journalist. So she was, that's interesting. So she didn't think crank, nutter, you know, and slam the phone down, and thank heavens she didn't. It could have ended there. And I'll tell you, one of the really, really weird things as well is the university found a second line to John's, another line which is down the all-female line as well. And one of the things that amazes me is that from Richard's eldest sister, Anne of York, it had to go, you know, mother, daughter, mother, daughter, mother, daughter, mother, daughter. You just needed one boy in there, and it's gone. And it didn't. It went all that way for 530 years. But then what's even more amazing is that the Ibsen line and the Dulag line, which is the other line that's been identified, these children are now sort of our age, they're getting on, and they're not having children. Both of those lines are going to die out now. So if we hadn't done it now, we would never have had the DNA to identify Richard.
That is remarkable. You've had a question already. Is there anyone else with a question anymore? Three at the back. We'll come back to you later, sir. Can you tell us your name, please?
Alison Pollard. Do you have any sense that Richard is glad to have been found?
Do you know what? Somebody asked me a similar question because they said, you know, is he going to be laid to rest in Leicester Cathedral? And meaning in the wider laid to rest. And do you know what? I think because this project has taken Richard III out of a minority interest group and a minority discussion point, because so many people around the world now know who he is, and because of the internet, they can now go on the internet and discover who he is for themselves and look at the same historic documents. I think that there's been a sea change, and it's been a massive sea change, because when you see general discussion on Richard III now, it's not the immediate child killing, murdering, hunched back, all the things they used to throw at him. It's now the warrior king, the medieval king, the last Plantagenet. So there's now this whole new discussion has started on Richard. And do you know what? When you look at his life and when you look at the way the man was, justice was so important to him. So important that, you see instances where he actually adjudicates against his own men for other people because he's giving them justice. And you even see where his enemies, his intractable enemies approach him and say, I've got this dispute, will you judge it for me? Because they knew that not only was he super intelligent, but that he was incredibly fair. And that above everything for Richard, he was just. And I think, laying him to rest and the fact that we are now questioning the dark legend, the fact that he has a chance, maybe, at justice and at the real man coming to the forefront. And I'm not saying the saint, but I just don't think he was this dark, evil creature that had been painted for the last 530 years. And I think we needed a powerful counterpoint to Shakespeare. And I think this is what it is. So, whether you think Richard should be buried in Leicester or York or Westminster or wherever, for me, I think we'll be laying him to rest because I think he'll be saying, for me, is that, my reputation is now with the people. If they think I am the evil murdering person, then that's fine. I'll take that. But at least they're questioning it and that I have a chance of justice. And so I think that's why we can lay him to rest.
Good, thank you. Two more questions up in that corner. The lady in purple and the gentleman on the right. Thank you. Could you tell us your name?
It's Tom Oxton. I was just wondering, would you like to try to improve your abilities, to do other things like this? Because there's membership forms in the hall there, you can decide.
Yeah, absolutely.
But being serious, have you tried anything else like that?
Well, funnily enough, since I've done this project, I've had other people get in touch with me and say I've always wanted to do whatever it is they've wanted to do. And what I've done is I've asked them to send me their research, because if it looks like it's a project that has some basis in something proper, then I would look at it. So there are 3 projects that I'm currently working on for other people to see if I can, because Richard was my dream project, but these other projects, I hope other people want to do them. And, we find other things, I don't know, but I suppose watch this space.
Thanks very much.
Okay, good. The lady in purple. Oh, she's saying no. Come on.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Sorry, lady over here.
Bridget McCarthy. It's just a thought. You're talking about testing DNA on people. If you're thinking about energies...
Sorry, can you hold the microphone close to your mouth?
Energies, and when the person's born and then dies, and then they talk about rebirth, maybe you were Richard III. That was your mission.
No. No. No, do you know what, weirdly, we all have this sixth sense and an inner sense of something or whatever it is, and I think, no, definitely not.
No.
Can
it be proved?
Huh?
Can it be proved?
I don't know.
Never know.
Right. Yeah. Never, yeah.
Are there any more questions? Lady just here. Could you tell us your name?
Gay Anand. I doused it, I think, on Richard's father's, going back 2 generations, that that would be his great-great-grandfather chose you.
Say again?
I think he chose you to bring the truth out.
Right. I mean, if he did, I would seriously love that. I would. But I think the funny thing is when I started this journey, I think dogged and determined, but I couldn't take no for an answer, and I don't know why I couldn't take no for an answer, but I couldn't. If anybody closed a door, I would just bang another door open, because I just thought we have to do this, and we have to do it now.
Could I ask a slightly heretical question to this audience that has been on the tip of my tongue for several questions now? Do you think that you would have found it more difficult to achieve what you have done if you had been a dowser and said so?
Yes, definitely. Because from what I've seen of working with the academic community, there is such a, I don't know if it's a fear or a clique or a box that they put themselves in, but it's like they're wearing these blinkers and they daren't take them off. You know, and the awful thing is, if they just took those blinkers off, I think our knowledge would just go through the roof. But they daren't, because they'll be looked on as cranks. And I think probably what, you know, those of you that have maybe looked into this project and seen some of the reports in the media and reports in various places, is that, you know, my sort of part in it, and even John Ashdown Hill's part in it, and that man he's got 3 degrees. Sounds like a pop group, but he's got 3 degrees. He's a very, very learned man. And they've even tried to call him a crank. You know, because if you're not in the sort of establishment, if you're not in a box that they can then happily box you into, yes, I think if I'd said I was a dowser, I don't think Richard Buckley would ever have got me anywhere near anything.
Just to follow on from that, how could dowsers present themselves to the public, and particularly to academics, to be taken seriously?
Do you know what? Maybe do a little of what I had to do, because I had to then go and see if the research backed up what I felt. And I think even if you have just a little bit of research, you know, you could say, well, I think the research might back this up because there's that. Do you want to look into it? But, you know, in saying that, that's almost... You almost don't want to do that, because what you really want them to do is to wake up a little bit to things that are beyond their understanding and beyond all our understanding. I don't know. I mean, there is, you know, I just think somebody in the scientific community really needs to investigate this properly and find out what's going on with, you know, with how we do this.
Okay, time is coming up behind us. Gentleman at the back who'd already asked one question, you wanted another go.
Thank you. It's really a follow-on from the question over there. Where do you think Richard III should be buried? Have you any preference on what about the Richard III Society? I don't think they're happy with Leicester.
Yeah, do you know, it's been, we never saw it coming really, this big sort of York-Leicester thing, and there's a lot of people have been saying Westminster Abbey as well, that he should be given that honour. But a judicial review, as you know, decided that it would be Leicester. But funnily enough, I never had an issue with the where he was going to be buried. My issue was the how. And what I did was I'd put into my agreements very specific clauses, so that if Richard III was found, that he was given what he didn't get in 1485. Because for me, by doing that, we do something really, really powerful. We make peace with the past. And I don't know, those of you that watched the recent 100 years anniversary of the breakout of the 1914 war, and the powerful things that they did in Belgium and how they were making peace with the past there, you know, and Germany and France hugged and did all of that. And that was a cousins' war. That was the royal families going to war. You know, the Wars of the Roses, York and Lancaster, this was a cousins' war. And the weird thing is, it's alive now today than it ever was in 1485. And I just would like the authorities to recognise that we really need to make peace with the past. And one of the things I want them to do is Richard was a pre-Reformation king. He was a Catholic king, and he was incredibly pious. And one of the things he didn't get was he wasn't taken to a place of sanctity and rest prior to his reburial, where masses could be said for his soul, and given all of those things that he never got. Now, I'm not religious, you know, I don't follow a religion, but Richard did. And what I'm trying to do in Leicester at the moment is try and get them to see that this is a very powerful thing to do. But because he's going to be buried in an Anglican cathedral, so we hope we will get him this and that they will see the light.
Okay. Just to finalise this, I'd like to ask Peter Farrell to come up and adjudicate over a vote on Richard Nisson's motion. Yeah. And could somebody please pass the microphone to Richard to ask him to propose it in very clear terms, and then we will take a vote.
Thank you very much indeed. The vote is, Philippa, were you doing unknowingly deviceless dowsing?
Okay, so those of you who think she was doing deviceless dowsing, please raise your hands.
Can I just ask, what's the other option?
Well, we'll come to that in a minute. We'll come to that in a minute. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you get a view?
Can I interject, please?
Okay.
If dowsing is an intuitive reaction, it's the same thing.
Okay. Whether she thought she was or not. Okay, so the lady who asked, is that the alternative, or is there another one?
Sorry, I'm Juanita, and I'm just interested because...
Hang on a sec.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Juanita, and I'm just interested because I work with spirits and ancestors who communicate through people different ways. One of the ways is nudging them in certain directions without the person really knowing that that's what they're doing. So that's why I was wondering, is there an option in your voting system or not?
Well, it wasn't part of the original proposal, but you've added it in.
That's fine. That's fine. We should have... I'm proposing deviceless dowsing, which we can vote on, and then you can
She's
have
proposing an ancestral nudge.
Yeah, and that you can vote on too. So
yes.
they've got
And
two
is there another option? A psychic. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well. Oh, go on.
Maybe it's a false option anyway. I mean, the bristle response you described, I would say is what I did with dowsing. You know, is it psychic? Probably. Does it matter?
Is that the general view? Thank you very much. And thank you in particular to Philippa for a wonderful talk. Very stimulating. Keep us buzzing for weeks. So
Thank you.
Oh,
sorry.
Can somebody please pass the microphone to Isabel? It's coming. Go ahead.
It's working. Given what you were saying about the iffiness with which some people view dowsing, would it embarrass you if we invited you to become a member of our society?
Thank you. Do you know what? I think we have to stand up and be counted now, don't we? So I would love to be a member. Thank you.